Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Paulo, your geography teacher. As always, it's an honor to have you here with me on Hey Illustrata. And in today's video, we're going to talk about Brazil's territorial formation and economic cycles. That's right, we're going to discuss these two topics because they're closely related, okay? Well, to start things off, as you know, Brazil is a country of continental proportions, the fifth largest country in the world. However, the country didn't always have these dimensions. Our current borders are the result of territorial exploration, expansion agreements, and also countless economic activities, right? Economic cycles that help the country expand inland. The sum of all these factors helps us understand how Brazil reached the dimensions it has today. We'll start our discussion here by talking about colonial Brazil, and we'll go all the way to the Republican period, okay? So stay with me until the end of the video. Well, as you've already learned in history classes, the Portuguese landed here in Brazilian territory in the year 1500. However, before that, right, in the year 1494, the infamous Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. Basically, what this treaty established was the division of the so-called discovered lands, in quotes, that would be explored by Portugal and Spain. To do this, a line was drawn 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. The eastern portion, including part of Brazilian territory, would be explored by Portugal. And all the rest to the west would be explored by Spain, as you can see on this little map. Throughout the 16th century, which marks the beginning of Portuguese exploration on Brazilian soil, what happened was the so-called coastal exploration, meaning there was no movement into the interior of the territory. And here the main economic activity was mainly the extraction of Brazil wood, which was a highly valued product in Europe, especially for making dyes. In addition, throughout the 16th century, sugarcane planting activities also began, as well as livestock farming. And during this period, the Feitorias stood out, which were a kind of military trading posts that essentially served to store these products, as well as to ensure the security of all these activities. Around the year 1538, the system of hereditary captaincies came into effect in the colony, which was basically the first form of territorial organization in Brazilian territory. They were basically a political administrative system, right? It was the first political administrative system in Brazil organized through plots of land that were donated to the so-called grantees with the goal of colonization and economic development, right? Of exploiting the riches of the colony. However, in practice, this system did not prove to be as effective as intended. In fact, only 3 captaincies actually succeeded, right? They were Pernambuco, Bahia, and São Vicente. And the reasons why the others did not prosper basically involved the costs and the administrative complexity of these lands. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, we finally have the beginning of the movement into the interior of Brazilian territory. Here's some economic activities stand out in this period. For example, livestock activities, which began to expand following the course of the rivers. As an example, we have the course of the São Francisco River, as you can see on this map. Another key point that marks the movement into the Brazilian interior is the beginning of the Bandeiras movement, which were expeditions that left São Paulo heading into the interior of the colony. This had 2 main objectives. The first was the capture of indigenous people for enslavement and trade, and the second was to find wealth, mainly precious stones and metals, which actually happened, didn't it? These riches were found, discovered here in Brazilian territory, mainly in the central southern region, which is now Minas Gerais, Mato Grosso, and Goiás. And here we have the beginning of the so-called gold cycle, which was nothing more than the exploitation of these riches, and the beginning of the settlement in the country's interior. And here, as you may have already noticed, this movement inland went beyond the limits established by the Treaty of Tordesillas, and it's in this context that the Treaty of Madrid comes in as a replacement. This treaty followed the principle of, which basically means whoever possesses it is the owner. In other words, it was claimed that Portugal was the legitimate owner of the territory because they were the ones actually occupying it. And here, the Treaty of Madrid is signed in 1750, which practically doubled the previous borders of Brazilian territory. And here, the country's borders basically become the ones we have today, with a few exceptions, as we will see next. When Brazil finally gains its independence, In the year 1822, the so-called Imperial period begins. But before that, just a quick message. Are you a student and want to optimize your geography studies? Do you need to save time preparing your classes? Then check out our mind map kits and ready-made Geo Illustrata slides. I took all the videos from the channel and turned them into slides and mind maps. Educational materials that are straight to the point and ready to use. And here, the territorial structure of the country changes significantly because we have the formal end of the hereditary captaincies, although the model had already proven to be flawed many years before. So in this period, the captaincies give way to the provinces, and political power becomes centralized in the country's capital, Rio de Janeiro at that time. The end of the empire and the beginning of the republic starts in the year 1889. And here the territory stops being organized and structured into provinces. And we begin to have the units of the federation, the states. But even with these changes in Brazil's political regime, territorial settlement was still very much driven by economic activities. As an example, we have the so-called rubber boom, which happened in the northern region of the country. And it basically consisted of extracting latex for export. Even though this activity had a relatively short cycle, which peaked between 1890 and 1920, latex played a very important role when it comes to the territorial occupation of the northern region. And here it's important to say that this occupation also went beyond the territorial limits of Brazil at that time. This resulted in the Petropolis Agreement, which was the purchase of the current territory of Acre, which previously belonged to Bolivia. And with that, Brazil established the borders and territory we know today. Besides rubber, another significant activity there in the 19th and 20th centuries was coffee, whose production was mainly concentrated in the southeastern region of the country. Coffee-related activities were thus essential for Brazil's economic development and also for the development of its infrastructure. So much so that it was largely because of the wealth generated by coffee that Brazil was able to industrialize in the following period, after 1930. And here, finally, the industrial period of Brazil emerges, which also consequently leads to urbanization.
Urbanização do país.
I'm not covering that in this video. For more on Brazil's industrialization and urbanization, check out the 2 videos on your screen. Thank you for staying with me until now. Don't forget to like, share, and also leave a comment to support the channel. Thanks. See you next time. Bye.